Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. Maliki Young Park dotting some of my chess, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. So, I do have the round 5 game for you between Levon Aronian and Garry Kasparov, the legend. And I did actually change my chess legend. Speaking of legends, I have Michaelis Max Uwe. Dutch grandmaster. Well, I mean, he ended up ultimately being a grandmaster. You know, he wasn't originally, because they started coming out with the titles in 1950, but he was the world champion from 1935 to 1937, and he was a FIDE president from 1970 to 1978, and he was actually the one that crowned Bobby Fischer world champion, put the wreath on his head and gave him the little medal. For those of you that are familiar with the clip, he was asking, why is my name not in there? And he was like, because we don't know who won yet, you know? Anyway, good stuff, good stuff. But I do have, like I said, the round 5 game, Levon Aronian and Garry Kasparov. Anybody who is coming, actually, first, my people in the Philippines, I will say mabuhay to you. Kamusta na aking kaibigan. Maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking mga video. Hello, you lit. Magandang umaga. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. As always, for anybody who is coming from Armenia, I will say Vog Juven to you, Ich Beses, and merci for coming by and taking a look at my video. Anybody who is coming from Russia, I will say Privyet, and I will say Dobre Otra, Kakadela, Spasibo for coming by and taking a look at my stuff. But if you guys are ready to go, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. So we got D4, D5, C4, C6. Ronaldo, man, it's a Slav. Like, look. Oh, man, you had to be there, man. I guess you had to be there. All right, anyway, we got knight to E3, knight to B6. We see knight to B3, knight coming to G6. So kind of a different, like, slight variation on a 4 knights type situation. Pawn takes D5, knight takes D5. And, you know, you have a decision. Do you want to, like, capture here, or do you want to try to avoid the capture? It's probably not, like, the best to capture, so we go ahead and see knight to C4. We got B5. Because we're like, hey, man, we don't like your knights. We're being hostile towards the knights. So we see knight to E5. Knight takes E5. Pawn takes E5. And then we do have queen to F5. Just immediately attacking that pawn. And we have Levon Aronian going knight to C5. And, you know, Garry Kasparov was like, hey, man, I'm not buying it. So he just takes on E5. So he's just now a pawn up. And I mean, it's just a true pawn. I mean, it's not, there aren't any tactics involved. You know, there's not any type of forks going on or anything like that. Man, my arrows they suck. So, I mean, like I said, it's just a true pawn. So we do have E4. And we actually see knight to F4 in the game. But we have a very interesting move that we can actually play as black. And that is actually F5. And this is because you absolutely cannot take on D5, because queen to E1 will be a very sad checkmate. So we are forced to, you know, maintain the disconnecting of the queen with the bishop. So, but like I said, we did see knight to F4. And this actually gives white a little bit. I mean, you are up a pawn, but this definitely gives white the ability to play some chess. So we see B4. Bishop comes to B6. We see bishop to C3. Why not, you know, put a tempo on the queen? So Garry says, hey, man, like, let me threaten checkmate in 1, because why not? As I always say, why not? We have G3. I mean, it's also possible to go bishop to F3 here, but it actually gives a lot to white, or to black, I'm sorry, in the situation. You know, bishop would take, pawn would be taken back. You know, you always had the ability of taking here. And so, yeah, it just ends up being a little bit worse than G3. G3 really forces the issue. I mean, because you do have this queen undefended. So you are forced to either check the king or just back up with the knight here. So we do see bishop takes C5 first, pawn takes C5, and then we do see knight to E6. And then we go ahead and trade queens. There's a little bit too much pressure on this pawn, so we're kind of forced to trade queens here. Deflect this knight away from attacking that pawn. Queen takes G5, knight takes G5, and then we do see bishop to C2, which is the only way to protect this pawn. So we got F6, F4, knight comes to E6, we see E5, You know, hoping that we have like some trades going on here because, you know, we are going to have a pretty weak pawn up here. So it's a little target we can attack. Pawn takes e5. We see long castles by white. Knight comes to d4. You're going to be, you know, kind of getting your pawn back anyway. So bishop takes d4, pawn takes d4. We see rook h to e1. You know, white is not in a hurry to take back this pawn because it is not going anywhere. And also it can't be defended. You know, yeah, I mean, even if you were to push the e-pawn, I mean, this pawn would take and stuff like that. I mean, there's just not a way to hold this pawn. So, you know, that's the thing you guys want to think about when you're playing your games. Like, if you are in a situation where you can take back a piece, or you can take back a pawn, if there's no way to defend it and it's going to drop regardless, try to see if you have a different move that you can make that's going to better your position. You know, first before you just automatically just do the take back. You should always be looking for other moves other than just automatic take back. You know, the Zweishenszug moves. Like, look for those. So we do see rook to b7. Rook does take d4 now. We got castles by black. Rook d to e4. So there's a lot of firepower lined up on this pawn. So bishop comes to f7 and saying, hey, I'm just going to get a counter attack. If you take my pawn, I take your pawn. So we have rook takes e7, rook takes e7, rook takes e7, and then we have bishop taking a2, and then rook takes on a7. So I mean, white has managed to get their pawn back. So everything is fairly even. I mean, you have same color bishops. Position is pretty open. So I mean, it's as you guys guessed, it's triple zeros. So we do see bishop coming back to d5. We see king up to d2. Rook goes over to b8. You know, we do have a pass pawn on the b file for black. So, like, you know, we're looking at possibly pushing that, trying to get it to score a touchdown. Bishop comes to d3. We see b4. King goes to c2. We see b3 with check. King comes to b2. We have rook over to e8. And we're not really threatening any penetration at the moment because the rook, you know, doesn't have that beautiful penetration square to go to yet. So the rook comes to d7. We see king over to f8. Bishop takes on h7, so this does allow penetration from the rook now. So rook comes to e2. We see king to c3. Rook takes on h2. We see bishop back to f5, or bishop to f5. Rook comes to g2. And we do see a very critical decision by Levon Aronian to actually capture this bishop on d5. So rook takes d5, and we see pawn takes d5, and then we have c6. So it kind of looks like, okay, you know, we have this, we have this square covered with the bishop, so the rook can't swing over. So it really just looks like this pawn is going to go ahead and score a touchdown. So we have actually reached the point in the game that if you do want to pause the video and see what move black can play here to give themselves some good chances. And it's also the only move to play in the position. Go ahead and pause the video and try to guess that move. Okay, cool. So, the move, if you guessed it, so the thing about whenever you're guessing a move, you're doing tactics, one of the things we always are taught to do is look for checks. So, the one check in the position that makes any sense is actually d4. So, if you came up with d4, congratulations. You were actually able to at least see the check. What this does, though, is it sets you up to be able to defend the queening of this pawn. And it is after this variation. King takes b3. Rook comes up to g3 with check. King goes to c4, and this now allows the rook to swing over to c3 with check on a dark square. And that's very important because you guys saw before that c2 was like an illegitimate square to come to. So we've changed the situation in such a way that we have given up some pawns, but we are going to be able to capture that only pawn that's passed, or the only completely passed pawn. We're just going to have a rook against the bishop. So king takes on d4, rook takes on c6. And as you guys can see, everything is fairly equal. So it's going to take a lot of defense in this position for Levon Aronian to hold this position because you are down an entire exchange. So it's not like it's completely over, but I mean, this is definitely a true test for Levon Aronian. So bishop comes to e4, rook goes to a6. We see king to e5, king comes down to e7, opposing the white king. King comes to f5, rook comes to a4. We're trying to restrict the king's movement because of course you can't just leave the bishop because it's going to get just taken for free. So bishop comes to c6. We see rook to c4. Bishop comes back to b7. Rook comes to d4. And then we do see bishop down to f3. And you know, a couple of the things that you want to think about when you're in this type of an imbalanced endgame where your opponent has like more strength. You always want to be careful to make sure that you're not placing your bishop to where it can be pinned or skewered. So you definitely want to like be very careful where you place the bishop like in any of these areas. You don't want to place the bishop too far away from the king, you know, because this rook does have the great ability to pin. You know, a lot of the times too, you want to make sure that you're keeping, you know, if it's like a king and a rook or a king and a bishop or king and a knight, like, you know, usually you do best when you keep the pieces together, you know, so that they can kind of like help each other out and stuff like that. You know, you want to try to be careful about putting pieces really far away from each other. So we do see rook up to d6. We see king to g5. Rook comes down to d3. We see bishop to h5. Rook comes to g3 with check. We see king over to h5. Or yeah, king over to f5. King comes to d6. Bishop comes up to f7. We see king to c5. King comes down to e4. We see rook down to g1. Bishop comes back to h5. King comes to d6. Bishop comes back to f7. King comes up to e7. Like I said, up to this point, I mean, Levon Aronian is really holding this game. He's playing very carefully. He's making sure that he doesn't move the bishop in like really bad spots. And of course, he's hoping for a repetition. I mean, you would love to get a repetition if you're, you know, if you're white in these positions. So bishop comes down to c4. We see king to f6. King comes down to f3. Rook goes over to a1. Bishop comes to d3, and then we do see rook to a3. And like I was saying before, remember, you know, this rook is now pinning this bishop. So you have to be in a position where you can step closer to the bishop and protect your bishop. So the king comes up to e4. We see king to g6. Bishop comes down to e2. Rook comes to a4 with check. We see king to e5. Rook comes down to a2. Bishop comes up to f3. We see rook down to a1. Bishop comes to g4. We see rook to e1 with check. King has to come over and sidestep this way. So we see king to d4. Rook comes to g1. We see bishop up to c8. Being very careful, like I said, because I mean, this rook check would be deadly if you put the bishop, like let's say, for example, the bishop comes up here. This is super deadly. This is just completely lost. So you have to be real careful. King comes to h5. We see king to e4. Rook to e1 with check. We see king to f5. Rook comes up to e8. And Levon Aronian, like I said, is doing a really good job of holding this position, but it is getting harder and harder to hold. You know, Garry Kasparov is just slowly outplaying Levon in this position. Bishop comes down to b7. We see rook to f8 with check. And I mean, we have pretty much reached a point where this is completely unwinnable for white. It's also possible, instead of rook to e8, g6 was actually really, really nice. You know, forcing the king up to f6. Rook would come up to e4, attacking this pawn. I mean, it's really hard to hold this pawn. So you'd be having to push to f5. G5 comes down, and, you know, you just have a nice little passer going on here. But like I said, you did see rook to f8 with check. King sidestepped over to e5. And then you have king to g4. And the thing about the position is you can always try to check with the bishop on this diagonal, but the king can move down. And, you know, this pawn is doing a really good job of holding this pawn's position. Even if you were to push it once, you can't push it twice because it's going to be getting pushed on a dark square. And this bishop does not influence the dark squares at all. So after we see king to g4, we see king to d4. And it is in this position that Levon does resign the game. And I think you can, I mean, it's pretty obvious like why that's an issue. I mean, this rook is going to attack this bishop. And what really nice thing that Garry Kasparov was able to do is he's able to separate these two pieces and put them in a bad spot. And they're not now in a situation where they can protect this pawn. So there's just too many issues for white. So if we back up, like I said, I mean, you know, if you're thinking maybe bishop to, you know, bishop to, oh, actually, no, that would just be. So forget what I said earlier. I forgot the rook was right there. So the rook is automatically taking the bishop if it tries to go there. So yeah, that's just a done deal. So forget what I said. I mean, that's if the rook was like down here or something like that. I mean, it'll make a little bit more sense. But anyways, so I mean, just going off from this position, I mean, you can take with the rook here. You can take with the king here if you want to. You can just, you know, you can attack this bishop first. You know, just pretty much whatever you want to do. You know, this is going to be the most logical. And then at some point, the bishop is probably going to have to give itself up for this pass pawn. And I mean, it's just going to be a king and a rook versus a king. And I think you guys might know how to do that checkmate. But that is that game. It was pretty interesting. Like I said, I mean, you know, Levon Aronian was like really trying hard to, you know, really hold it. And he played really good for a while. But the nature of the situation when you're down that type of material is the fact that usually at some point, especially when you have like, let's say a queen and a king versus a king and a rook, you know, you're going to usually get into a tactical position where you can force the pieces apart from each other. And it's just going to be a complete win. There's a lot of technique involved in a king and queen versus a rook and a queen. That is an insane amount of technique involved in that game. But anyway, I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Merci for anybody coming from Armenia. Spasibo for anybody coming from Russia. And maraming salamat aking makaibigan. Mabuting pagbati ingat lagi to you guys. And I will see you guys next time.